Have you ever sat alone in your living room, maybe in the quiet of the evening, and asked yourself, where did I go wrong? You gave everything, your time, your love, your sacrifices, and yet, somehow, your children speak to you with sharpness, ignore your calls, or treat your presence like an inconvenience. It hurts. More than physical pain, it cuts deep into the heart. If you're a parent over 60, especially here in the US, you may be feeling this more than ever. Times have changed, values have shifted, and what used to be respect now often feels like distance or even disrespect. But here's the truth I want to share with you today. This is not the end of the road. It's not too late to reclaim your dignity, your voice, and yes, your respect. In this video, we'll walk through 6 powerful, time-tested ways to rebuild that respect. Not by yelling, not by begging, but by quietly, firmly, and wisely standing in your worth. And before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Have you experienced this kind of disrespect from your children? Type yes in the comments if you have, or share your story if you feel ready. You are not alone in this. Make sure you subscribe as well. We talk about real-life wisdom for those of us who've seen a few more seasons than most. Now, let's begin with the first way to regain the respect you deserve. Number 1. Set boundaries without guilt. Let me tell you about Margaret. She's 72, lives in Arizona, and spent her entire life doing everything for her 3 kids. Babysitting at the drop of a hat, giving loans that were never paid back, cleaning up messes, literal and emotional. But the more she gave, the less they seemed to appreciate her. One day, her youngest yelled at her for not answering the phone quickly enough. That was her breaking point. Instead of lashing out or shutting down, Margaret did something different, something bold. She wrote each of her children a letter. Calm, clear, honest. She told them she loved them deeply, but that she would no longer tolerate being treated like a servant or a punching bag. She started saying no when she needed to. She stopped picking up calls during dinner. She reclaimed her time, her energy, and slowly, something shifted. Her kids didn't like it at first, but over time, they began to respect her again. Here's the truth. People don't respect what they can take for granted, children included. Setting boundaries isn't a punishment. It's a lesson in self-respect. When you model it, you teach it. Now I know some of you might be thinking, but isn't that harsh? Isn't family supposed to be about sacrifice? Yes, but not at the cost of your mental and emotional well-being. You deserve peace, too. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever tried setting boundaries with your children? How did they respond? And don't forget, if this resonates, hit that subscribe button. We've got 5 more strategies coming that can truly change your relationship with your children. Number 2, stop trying to be liked. Focus on being respected. Imagine this scenario. You're at your daughter's house for a family dinner. The grandkids are glued to their phones. Your son-in-law barely acknowledges you, and your own child interrupts you mid-sentence to correct you over something trivial. You laugh it off. You stay quiet. You don't want to ruin the mood. Now, let me flip this for you. Imagine instead that you calmly stand up, look your child in the eye, and say, I came here to be with family. If I'm being treated as a burden, I can go home. And then you follow through, not in anger, but with quiet strength. That moment changes everything. See, too many of us, especially as we age, fall into the trap of trying to stay relevant by being agreeable. We think that if we just stay quiet, smile, bake cookies, say yes to everything, they'll love us. But love without respect feels hollow, and chasing their approval often leads to losing your own self-worth. Respect is not about being feared. It's about being consistent, grounded, and unapologetically yourself. When you stop trying to please and start holding your head high, people, yes, even your children, start seeing you differently. Psychologists have studied this. The pleaser parent often loses authority over time, but the parent who holds a firm, loving presence, that's the one who gets called for advice. That's the one whose words still carry weight. Ask yourself this. Are you more afraid of being disliked or being disrespected? Comment below. Have you ever found yourself biting your tongue just to avoid conflict with your kids? And what would it feel like to stop doing that? If you're finding this helpful, take a second and hit that like button. It tells me we're walking this road together. Ready for the third way to regain your respect? Number 3. Understand the psychology behind disrespect. It's not always about you. Let's look at something surprising for a moment. According to a study published in the Journal of Family Psychology, adult children who exhibit disrespectful behavior toward their parents often do so not out of hatred or lack of love, but out of unresolved personal stress, anxiety, or even guilt. In fact, nearly 68% of adult children who reported having a strained relationship with a parent also admitted to feeling ashamed of how they treated them. That's right, ashamed. Now, why is this important? Because it tells us that sometimes the disrespect you feel isn't actually about you. It's a reflection of what's going on inside them. When your son snaps at you for asking a simple question, when your daughter rolls her eyes at your opinion, it may not be personal at all. It might be stress from work, guilt about not visiting more often, or frustration about their own lives. But if you take it personally every time, it will eat you alive. Understanding this doesn't mean you excuse bad behavior, but it does mean you don't carry the full emotional weight of it on your shoulders. So instead of reacting with hurt or anger, try this. Pause, breathe, and gently say, "That sounded sharp. Are you okay?" It puts the responsibility back on them, without escalating the situation. This shift in perspective can give you emotional power, because when you stop internalizing every insult, you reclaim peace. You stop making their behavior a mirror of your worth. And that, my friend, is powerful. Let me ask you, has there ever been a time your child lashed out and later apologized, saying they were just stressed? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your experiences. And if this insight helped you breathe just a little easier, hit that subscribe button. We're not done yet. There's still more wisdom to uncover. Number 4. Reignite your sense of purpose beyond parenting. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's a quiet morning. You're sitting by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the same yard, the same sky, the same silence. The phone hasn't rung in days. The house is tidy but empty. You start to wonder, is this it now? Just waiting to be called, waiting to feel needed again. This feeling is more common than you think. Many parents, especially after 60, unconsciously tie their identity and their value to being needed by their children. So when that need disappears, when your children build their own lives and forget to look back, it can feel like you've been left behind. And that's when disrespect hits the hardest, because you're already feeling invisible. But here's a powerful truth. You are more than a parent. You always have been. When you begin to rediscover your sense of purpose, whether it's mentoring others, volunteering, learning something new, or simply investing in friendships, you radiate a different kind of energy, and that energy commands respect. Think of it this way. When your life revolves solely around your children, you're orbiting them. But when you build your own center of gravity, they begin to orbit you again. They notice. They pay attention. I've seen it happen. A retired teacher I knew named Harold started writing poetry at 75. He published a small collection online. His kids, who once brushed off his calls, suddenly began calling him to talk about his poems. Not because he chased their attention, but because he had rekindled something within himself that made them see him differently. So ask yourself, what's something you used to love that you've let go of? Or something new you've always wanted to try? Share it in the comments. Let's spark that fire again. If this part is striking a chord with you, hit that like button and don't stop now. The next step we're going to talk about might surprise you, but it's one of the most powerful yet. Number 5. Reclaim the power of your silence. Let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine 2 different scenes. In the first, your adult son raises his voice at you during a conversation. You immediately respond, hurt, defensive, trying to explain yourself, trying to fix it. The words fly back and forth, faster and louder. And when it's all over, you're exhausted, maybe even ashamed of how it went. In the second scene, he raises his voice. But instead of reacting, you simply look at him. Calm, steady. You pause. Then you say, "We can talk when you're ready to speak with respect." And you walk away. In the first scene, you gave him your energy. In the second, you took back your power. There is something deeply powerful about silence, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. When you stop engaging in emotional tug-of-war, you signal that your dignity is not up for debate, that your presence is not something to be handled carelessly. And this isn't just poetic, it's scientific. Psychologists refer to this as disengaging from reactive behavior. It's one of the strongest ways to shift a power dynamic in a relationship. When someone expects a reaction and gets calm silence instead, it forces them to reflect, even if they won't admit it. Now let me be clear. This doesn't mean giving the silent treatment to punish. This is about choosing when and how you speak and refusing to match someone's disrespectful tone. You're not withdrawing, you're protecting your peace. So next time your child speaks harshly, ask yourself, does this need a response? Or is my silence the loudest message I can send? Have you ever tried staying silent instead of arguing? How did it play out? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. If this is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button. We're almost there. One final, powerful step remains, and it might be the most healing of them all. Number 6, forgive, not for them, but for you. There's a story I once heard about a man named Walter. He was 80, living alone in Oregon. His 2 children hadn't visited in nearly a year. One day, after another missed holiday, he told his neighbor, "I don't think they care about me anymore." The neighbor asked, "Have you forgiven them?" Walter scoffed, "Why should I? They haven't even said sorry." But over time, Walter realized something. The bitterness he held was poisoning his peace. His children may never change, but he could. So he wrote a letter, not to send, but just to say everything he needed to say. The hurt, the anger, the disappointments. Then, he wrote one final sentence. "I choose to let this go, not because you deserve it, but because I do." That day, Walter didn't get his kids back, but he got himself back. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It's not about pretending the pain didn't happen. It's not about letting someone off the hook. It's about cutting the rope that's tying you to resentment. Because here's the truth. Carrying bitterness doesn't punish them. It punishes you. It ages you. It isolates you. It steals your joy. But when you forgive, truly forgive, something powerful happens. You begin to glow again. Your heart softens. Your smile returns. And from that place of peace, respect naturally begins to grow again, even if slowly. In many cases, forgiveness is the bridge back to connection. Not always. But even when it's not, it's the path to freedom. Have you been holding on to something for too long? Is there something you're ready to release? Share it in the comments, even anonymously. Sometimes, naming the pain is the first step toward healing. And if you've made it this far, consider liking this video, because this journey we're on, it matters. There's just one final message I want to leave you with. You've made it to the end of this conversation, but maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning of something more important. Reclaiming your place, your strength, and your peace as an elder, a parent, and a person of deep value. Let's be honest, raising children is one of the hardest things we ever do. And watching them grow into adults who forget the sacrifices, who speak without kindness, who distance themselves, that's a different kind of heartbreak. One you don't prepare for. One no book ever warns you about. But you're not powerless. You're not forgotten. You're not done. You've now got 6 tools, real, grounded, powerful tools, to stand tall again. Boundaries, self-respect, understanding, purpose, silence, forgiveness. These are not just strategies. They are forms of quiet rebellion against invisibility. And don't think for a second that it's too late. Respect can be lost, but it can also be earned back. Not through force, not through guilt, but through a quiet strength that says, "I still matter." Before you go, leave me a comment. Which of these 6 steps spoke to you the most? Which one do you feel ready to try first? And if this video gave you even a moment of clarity, comfort, or courage, please subscribe. We're building a community here, a place where elder wisdom is not only respected, it leads the way. Because the world may have changed, but the power of your presence hasn't. Let's remind them who we are.